So as you saw in the video, EC2 offers you a variety of payment options, depending on your specific needs, right? If you kind of sporadically use things, we have the on-demand option. If you know you're going to be using computational resources over a extended period of time, there's of course reserved instances and savings plans. There's somewhere like you don't really care, when it's running. You kind of just use the leftover resources of AWS. That's going to be spot instances. And then we have dedicated hosts where it's basically an entire virtual server hardware just for you. So that's going to be the most expensive. All right, so on-demand pricing. On-demand instances allow you to pay for compute capacity by the second or hour with no long-term commitments. So you don't know how much you're going to be using the service for. You just kind of want to test it out. Or maybe you just want to, see how the service works. You not just want to test your application, but you also want to test AWS. A good idea would definitely be on demand. So short-term, unpredictable workloads, specifically testing is a great use case. So the pros, of course, are going to be that there's no upfront payments, there's no commitments, it's flexible, and you can scale up how many resources you want. You want to use more resources, easy to do. The cons, it's kind of expensive compared to long-term options. So the longer you commit, the more savings you're going to get, which totally makes sense, right? You're buying more, so they're going to subsidize it over time. So use cases, again, developing, testing, running applications that have unpredictable usage patterns. Reserved instances. So now, say you do want to commit. Reserved instances are going to be an option for that. So they require a commitment of 1 or 3 year terms for running the instance in exchange for significant discounts. So you're going to be using the instance for a while. If you want to get some savings, you can commit to 1 or 3 years. So there are 2 types of reserved instances, one with more flexibility, one with a little bit less. Obviously, the more flexibility is going to cost you, right? But yeah, this is still a lot more savings compared to on-demand. And if you go for the 3-year option, you're going to maximize the savings. So they're a longer-term alternative to on-demand instances. So reserved instances pricing. So let's see. So best for long term. So let's just say greater than a year. I'll go ahead and fix that. The pros is it's deep cost savings over time in comparison to on-demand instances. Because it is long-term. Again, the con is going to be, that you have to commit long-term. And then the pricing does apply to a single instance. We'll talk about that in a sec once we get to savings plan. So you're buying one instance, you're committing to a certain amount of time, so it's best for long-term. I'll go ahead and fix that. So some use cases could be maybe a database that you're going to be running 24/7, an enterprise application. So that means, enterprise applications are, for example, could be something from Microsoft, right? So you got to make sure you're very stable, right, for your customers. So then you're going to want to use something like a reserved instance. Microservices and containers, we're going to talk about that later in this lesson. But yeah, this is another example where they run continuously and uninterrupted. You're going to want to have a reserved instance. So what is a standard reserved instance? So standard reserved instance is going to be a little bit more limited than the convertible one. We're going to talk about that one next. So this requires not only the long-term time commitment, but you're going to also have to commit to a specific type of instance in a specific region. So you really got to know a lot about your application upfront. But again, that's going to maximize your savings, right? Flexibility is going to cost you. So you're going to have to assign the following stuff up front. The type of instance, the size, the platform description, so the configuration, right, of the hardware, such as operating system, tenancy. Do you want default or dedicated tenancy? So if you want to learn more about tenancy, definitely click on that link. But basically, tenancy just means, are you sharing servers or are you not? You're locked into the instance type, family size and region that you reserve over the commitment term. But because you're locking in, you're sacrificing that flexibility. you're going to get the deepest discounts. There is an alternative, right, where you do get some flexibility, and that's the convertible reserved instance. So they offer a more flexible commitment that allows you to exchange the instance type, family size, or even operating system during the term. So you can tweak things around. You're not locked in. So you can request to exchange the instance type or family. It is less savings than standard reserved instances. You are paying for that flexibility, but you're still going to get a lot of savings in comparison to on-demand. So it's great for workloads where the requirements may change over time. So maybe the region needs to change, maybe the type needs to change. But your commitment, right, to that long term is still there, at least greater than a year. And then, of course, we have another option to long-term commitments, which is savings plans. So savings plans, while not as cheap as reserved instances, are going to be cheaper than on-demand. They're going to offer way more flexibility than the reserved instances, not just in terms of configuring stuff, because convertible already does that, but also the number of instances. So savings plans, very flexible. It's kind of a middle ground between on-demand and reserved instances. So they do have the long-term commitment of reserved instances, but you're going to get a ton of flexibility similar to on-demand. The difference in the commitment is that with reserved instances, you kind of know what you're going to pay up front. Because you have all these ideas about the specifications of your app, of your compute needs in the beginning, you're going to pretty much pay a flat rate. Now with savings plans, you're not paying a flat amount at the beginning in upfront costs. You're actually locking yourself into a rate. You're saying, hey, this is what I'm going to pay per hour for 1 or 3 years. So it's best for workloads requiring vast flexibility and expecting a consistent compute usage. The difference between reserved instances is you're going to get total freedom on the configuration, the type, but also the number of instances you can launch, which is really cool. So use cases are going to be for databases, enterprise applications, microservices. So similar to reserved instances, but you're going to get way more flexibility. So maybe your app is in the development stage, right? Maybe you don't know how many instances you need, the types. So savings plans could be an excellent choice when you need that flexibility. So the pros, unlike the RIs, you're not locked into specific type, size, OS tenancy. It can apply to any number of instances as long as their total compute usage does not exceed the commitment. So not only are you locking into a rate, and because you're not locking into one instance, right, or a certain number of instances, you're locking yourself into a max compute usage. You're saying, this is how much I think I'm going to use. So they're going to give you a certain rate. The higher capacity you foresee, the lower the rate's going to be, right? So again, the more you buy, the more you save. So it automatically applies your discount rate to any eligible instance, again, as long as you're not passing that limit. The cons, it does require a commitment based on usage amount. So you do have to kind of estimate how much you're going to use. If you do use anything beyond that commitment, beyond that limit, that max capacity that you expected, you're going to be charged the on-demand rates, which, as we know, are pretty expensive. Spot instances pricing. Say your workload is flexible. You don't really care when it starts, when it stops. This might be for a batch process, a web crawler, something that you want to run in the background. You don't really care of how quickly or when. You're not really dealing with users maybe for this particular computing needs. Spot instances are great. So it's basically unused EC2, so leftover EC2 capacity that's offered at steep discounts, 90% off of on-demand. It's really good for workloads that, again, the start and end times are flexible, interruptions are okay. It's very, very cost effective. The cons is that they can stop your instance whenever they want. AWS doesn't know if it's going to have a lot of leftover, so they might, cut you off so that they can give those resources to somebody who's actually paying more, right? Whether it's a reserved instance or on demand. Now we have dedicated hosts. So this is kind of expensive. In fact, the most expensive compared to the other options, because you're basically telling AWS, hey, all those ideas of sharing servers amongst other people, I don't want you to do that. I want you to give me your physical servers just for me. So this section, right, of your data center, these servers will be just for me. I don't want you sharing them with anybody else. Why would anybody need that? Well, maybe you have strict licensing or compliance requirements. Maybe you're a government organization. Maybe you're trying to meet some state licensing, some commercial licensing, because you're selling your product, right? So it's important, right, that you're not sharing these servers with anybody else because maybe your data is sensitive. If you're sharing servers, right, there's technically, right, a risk, right, of data leaks, or that doesn't really happen nowadays, but right, licensing is still going to expect that. They're going to say, hey, even though the risk is small, there is still a risk there. So we want you to just have servers just for us, so that our data is kind of compartmentalized. We don't want to expose our data to anybody else. And the best way to do that is just by having servers just for us. So the pros: you control hardware and instance placement. You can use existing server-bound software licenses. So they already have pretty much services ready for whichever license you need to satisfy, whichever rules you need to satisfy. Cons is, of course, it's really expensive. All right, so scaling, right? You set up your EC2 instance, you're running it, but as we know, it's not always easy to know how much compute resources you need. It's sometimes impossible to know, hey, I'm going to need this amount of memory and computational resources at this time of day, right? Especially if your app's running 24/7. Say you're an e-commerce app, right? Or maybe you're a social media app. You're going to have different amount of users at different times of day. Maybe during the lunch hour, right? You're going to expect a lot more users or customers. So that's where scaling your resources, getting more resources or using less, right, during the downtime is important so that you save money. Well, EC2 does offer some scaling tools. So go ahead and watch this video, part 1 of EC2 scaling, and we'll pick up right after.